Now we're going to look at that first encounter between Europeans and Native Americans. And one thing I want to consider before diving into this is why Europeans? Why was it the Europeans that first encountered the Native Americans rather than another society from Asia or Africa? And I want to first say that Europeans were not the only ones that had the technological advancements to reach North America, but it had in large part to do with an outward looking culture that sought to spread religion, that sought to trade, and that sought to explore. There were many societies in the quote-unquote old world that could have technologically reached North America, but they simply did not have the desire to do so. For example, in the Muslim world, the Quran dictated that they not move past the Mediterranean Sea, so that it was in their religion that they did not spread and explore and look outward in that way. That is not the case for Europe. When you get to places like China sent large expeditions around. They could have reached North America if that was their goal, if that was ever their intention, but on their short exploring expeditions, they were basically convinced that the world was full of barbarians and uncivilized people, and that they needed to just go home and focus inwardly on their empire instead of looking outwardly, that it was pointless to look outward into the rest of the world. And also, most of their naval excursions were to show the power and might of the Chinese Navy rather than to actually discover new lands or spread religion or any of those types of things that Europe was more concerned with. So that is in part why Europe was the first to discover, quote unquote, North America. As we've talked about in lecture 1, there were already people living there, but Europeans had a couple of reasons and motivations for leaving the continent and exploring. One of those would be trade. So Europe wanted to trade with places like China, and they did not want to have to pass through the Ottoman Empire, which was really just situated on the Silk Road, directly on the overland pass from Europe to Asia. They didn't want to have to pass through the Ottoman Empire. It was a Muslim empire, and it would be cheaper and safer for them to just bypass the land route altogether and go by sea. But it was very long and expensive. They had to sail around Africa in order to ever get to China and India. So they thought, let's just sail west. And they knew that the world was round, and they expected to just end up on the shores of India or China. As we know, in fact, they did not. But trade was the primary factor in the Europeans' excursion westward to find routes to China and India. One thing that also allowed Europeans to have the freedom to explore and find new lands was technology, and specifically the invention of the caravel, which was a small type of ship that could actually sail against the wind. And that was important because before this time, people had to rely on wind and currents in order to get them to specific places. So let's say if you were sailing from Europe to Africa, you had to follow the wind, land in Africa, and then wait for the wind currents to shift so that you could sail again back home to Europe. And if you were stuck in a port in Africa for some time, you just were stuck there and there was nothing you could do about it. But now with the invention of the caravel, they were able to sail against the wind, and that gave them a lot more freedom in their exploration. They also had compasses and navigational tools which helped them know where they were going. Didn't quite help them enough to know that there's a lot more distance between Europe and India, that there's a whole continent in the way, but they were able to navigate those seas more precisely with their navigational tools. Religion also played a very large part in this desire to spread outwards. And we talked about how in Islam there was not this desire to spread beyond the Mediterranean. In China there was no missionary zeal to spread Chinese life to outside peoples. China was basically convinced that they had the greatest society. They needed to look inward and not outward to the uncivilized barbarians. But in Europe, there was this missionary zeal to spread Christianity. And part of that came from Jesus' words to baptize all nations, to go forth and spread the good news about his message. The religious motives of Europeans to spread their religion had a militaristic zeal to it. It wasn't just about preaching the message of Jesus Christ and converting people, which went hand in hand with it, but it was also about conquering people and spreading Christianity through military might. And that tradition can be traced back to the Crusades, where the Catholic Church believed that it was their goal and their mission to conquer Jerusalem and hold it, to liberate it from Muslims, and that Jerusalem needed to be in Christian hands. So they waged a series of crusades where all of Europe really pooled their resources and military might together to try to conquer and control Jerusalem. This religious militaristic zeal would also be furthered, especially in Spain in the 1400s, when Spain basically decided that it wanted to reconquer the peninsula in the name of Christianity. Prior, Arabs had moved in from North Africa and conquered part of the peninsula. Spain in the 1400s and through a series of campaigns wanted to reconquer the peninsula from Arabs and Muslims. And once they did so, once they waged this holy war against Islam to reconquer the peninsula in the name of Christianity, they started to kick out Muslims and Jews from the peninsula. So it was this religious zeal to promote Christianity through military might and to convert other people, and if they were not willing to convert, to force them out. So this is happening in Spain at the time that Christopher Columbus goes to the Spanish king Ferdinand and his wife Isabella and says, hey, we're going to go west. I'm going to reach India and Asia, and we're not only going to find riches and enrich the Spanish Empire through trade, can convert the Chinese to Christianity, and the Chinese will help us against Islam. So a lot of these early voyages to the Americas carried with them the historic baggage of the Crusades and the historic baggage of the Reconquista of Spain from the Muslims and the expulsion of the Jews. You also had a lot of religious warfare in Europe in the 1500s because of the Protestant Reformation. So beforehand, the whole European continent was really religiously united around the Catholic Church. The Catholic Church controlled all aspects of most people's lives in Europe for centuries, until the Protestant Reformation, where a German monk protested against some Catholic practices, ended up unintentionally fracturing the church into a lot of different denominations. The Catholic Church was then in rivalry with Protestant denominations of Christianity, and depending on what religion each European leader chose to follow, whether it was a Protestant religion like Lutheranism or the Catholic religion, their whole kingdom would then be forced to follow their religion. So then you had a fracturing of Europe among different kings and their religions, and the Protestants and the Catholics went to war against each other, trying to fight to conquer, to destroy the other, the Protestants against the Catholics against the Protestants. So you have this religious fracturing that way, and both the Catholics and the Protestants then want to spread their version of Christianity abroad. So it creates this element of competition amongst Christendom itself. So Europeans coming into the Americas had this militaristic missionary zeal, and then that also colored how they interacted with Native Americans. And there were several different ways that the Europeans saw the Native Americans. One of them was kind of in this condescending positive light, that Native Americans were quote-unquote noble savages, that they were living without any civilization, without any religion, without any culture, but they were kind of living like Adam and Eve did in the early years, right? Before sin, before corruption. So they're living with total freedom. They're living as one with nature. They don't have any of the trappings of city life and corruption, like, alcohol, brothels, the accumulation of wealth, things that could be seen as negative. So some Europeans looked at them as the ideal lifestyle. Like, if we can only escape the stress of the city and go live out in nature, like the early people, like the Native Americans, we can be noble and pure and untainted like them. Or you had the idea that they were uncivilized barbarians, and Europeans had their own cultural norms and what they thought civilization should look like. And when they came to the Americas and they saw Native American society, they didn't see the markings of what they considered to be civilization. They saw Native Americans living in a different relationship with the land, and Europeans didn't recognize or respect that. They said, you're wasting your land, you're not making use of it, you're uncivilized, you're not chopping the trees down, you're not farming, you're not building large cities and conquering the land. They didn't see churches as they recognized churches in Europe, so they said, well, they don't have religion. And you can see in this image here, they put a little devil above the Native American housing because they said, well, they don't have religion, so that they must be devil worshippers. They're uncivilized barbarians, and they needed to be trained and civilized by Europeans. That was a very common viewpoint towards the Native Americans. So again, because they did not see churches as they recognized them in Europe, they thought that Native Americans did not have religious life, did not have these traditions, did not have beliefs about the metaphysical. They didn't have this beliefs of a creator or spirits or metaphysical realm, when we know that Native Americans in fact did. They did believe in a creator, and they believed in spirits that were living within everything, whether the trees or animals. But because Europeans did not see what they expected to find, they said, well, they must be devil worshippers. They also did not respect the Native American conceptions of land. The fact that you can live in harmony with land rather than conquer it and make use of it did not make sense to Europeans. So when Europeans showed up and said, well, you're not gating in your property, you don't have private property, that was very foreign for Europeans. Europeans believed in private property, and it led to some clashes. So when Europeans showed up and said, well, who owns this land? Native Americans were like, well, I don't know what you're talking about. And Europeans said, show me a deed that you actually own this land. Show me a piece of paper. Show me some documentation. Native Americans did not have that conception of land ownership, so they didn't have deeds to properties as Europeans expected them to. So Europeans often use that as an excuse. Nobody legally owns this land. It is free for the taking. They also did not respect the gender division. So in the earlier lecture, we talked about how Native Americans, women had more rights in Native American society. Europeans looked at this and saw women doing manual labor along with men. As we can see in this European image of Native Americans, it was usually the man's job to go hunting, and the woman would also mostly do agricultural work at home. Europeans saw Native American women doing this manual labor and said, this is an upside down society. Women should not be doing work. They should be in the home only. And they would depict images like this with women out in the fields working, and they would use it to try to get sympathy for Native Americans. They wanted other Europeans to look at images like this. And first of all, the women are depicted as European, almost like the birth of Venus, as you can tell. Very European, along European beauty standards, and they wanted Europeans to look at this and feel bad for the Native American women, and to see something wrong in a society that allows women to go out and work, and to see something wrong with the man who would allow that, so that the man is emasculated, he's feminine, because he's not doing all the work. I'm sure he's hunting and gathering, but he's not doing all the farm work. And because he's not doing all the farm work and controlling his home and family and keeping it in proper order, with the woman at home taking care of the kids and him out in the world taking care of societal matters and work, there was something wrong with the men, and that the women needed saving. That's why they depicted the women as Europeans. They wanted Europeans to feel sympathy for these women who were quote-unquote forced to work outside of the home. And it was this idea that this society needed to be saved and civilized by Europeans, that the women needed to be taught what their role was, and the men needed to be trained in European ways and quote-unquote civilized in that way. There was also this idea that Native Americans had too much freedom. We talked about this idea of Native Americans living like early man, being noble savages, and that being a good thing. But for most Europeans, that was a bad thing. They had too much freedom. Freedom was a privilege that needed to be earned, but you couldn't just have too much freedom. It was going to create laziness, slothfulness. That if you have too much freedom, it's because you're closer to your animal nature. So animals have freedom. I have cats. My cats don't have any responsibilities. They just lounge around. They eat when I feed them. They get to do what they want all day, right? It's a similar idea that if people are living like that, they're similar to animals. They don't have responsibilities. They don't have civilization. They don't have societies, that they're not living as people are supposed to. They're just lounging on a hammock, enjoying the bountiful land, that they are not observing laws and the typical markings of society. Of course, this was not the case for Native Americans. It's how Europeans saw them. Here is one quote from an Italian explorer on his first encounters with the Native American. "We think they have neither religion nor laws, that they do not know of a first cause or author, God, that they do not worship the sky, the stars, the sun, the moon, or other planets, nor do they even practice any kind of idolatry. We do not know whether they offer any sacrifices or other prayers, nor are there any temples or churches of prayer among their people. We consider that they have no religion and that they live in absolute freedom and that everything they do proceeds from ignorance." And this is this European idea. They don't have civilization. They don't have complex societies. They don't have religion or traditions or culture. They're just living in freedom as animals. So, in the Spanish Empire, which is not the focus of this class, but it's important to talk about, again, Spain was informed by this Reconquista, this military campaign to reclaim Spain from Muslims. And directly after that, they have this same mentality when exploring the Americas. So we have these conquistadors or soldiers, these conquerors, who are showing up in Central and South America to conquer the land for the Spain, to extract riches, and to convert the native populations to Christianity. That is one of the primary goals, that the people be converted to Christianity and made allies and subservient to Spain. What many of the conquistadors and Spanish do when they land in the Americas is create this encomienda system where Native Americans are basically enslaved in a mission or a plantation and forced to work for the Spanish. And the idea was that in forcing them to do manual labor for the Spanish, that they would learn European culture, that they would learn European farming, and that they would be quote-unquote improved. That the women would stop doing farm work, the women would know their place, that they would create a patrilineal society, a patriarchal society where the men become men as they're supposed to be. They follow Christianity and they're subservient to the Spanish Empire. In the Spanish Empire, though, mostly men come over to the Americas. The conquistadors were mostly male soldiers. So there was more intermixing between them and the indigenous populations. Most of it, of course, there are power dynamics that are not equal. A lot of these relationships are forced. There is a lot of rape of the indigenous women. But what would result from this intermixing was this caste system in which you have Europeans born in Spain at the very top, Europeans born in the Americas right under them, and then different degrees of mixed populations in the middle, and usually enslaved Africans and indigenous people were at the very bottom of this system. So how was it that the Spanish were able to send these small bands of conquistadors over to these large, complicated societies in Central and South America and conquer a lot of it with very few people? How was it that they were able to conquer these empires such as the Aztec, specifically the Aztec? Part of it was technology and strategy. They had gunpowder. They benefited from their trade connections to China, where they got the technology to have gunpowder and guns in the way that the Native Americans did not, because they did not have this connection to China. So Europeans benefited from the technology trade between Asia, Africa, Europe, whereas the Native Americans were mostly isolated and were not exposed to these different technologies. Another was strategy and how they related with Native Americans. They came in with the intent to topple these empires. This is the pronouncement to be read by Spanish conquerors to defeated Indians. So they had requirements for them. If you do not do this and maliciously make delay in it, I certify to you that with the help of God we shall powerfully enter into your country, and shall make war against you in all ways and manners that we can, and shall subject you to the yoke and obedience of the church and of their highness. We shall take you and your wives and your children, and shall make slaves of them, and as such shall sell and dispose of them as their highness may command. We shall take away your goods, and shall do you all the mischief and damage that we can, as to vassals who do not obey, and refuse to receive their lord, and resist and contradict him. And we protest that the deaths and losses which shall accrue from this are your own fault, not that of their highnesses, or ours, nor of these cavaliers who come with us. So this is the Spanish attitude towards Native American kingdoms and societies. It is one of conquest. It is the same mentality they had with them in reconquering Spain from the Muslims. And they would be very brutal to the Native Americans, and they would use this brutality as evidence that if you do not submit to us, you are going to be met with tortures, you are going to be met with violence and brutality. And it was this method to also try to scare them. They also used alliances to topple large empires like the Aztecs. So Cortez, the Spanish conquistador, would make alliances. He had an interpreter, and he would make alliances with the enemies of the Aztec. So the Aztec Empire was very large. And when you become a large empire like Rome or any empire of the past, you have enemies. You have people that you've conquered. So Cortez would go to these different subservient nations of the Aztecs and convince them to join with him to topple the Aztecs. In some of these meetings, the Spanish would create a meeting with Native Americans and end up killing the Native American leaders who arrived to deal with them, thus chopping the head off the leadership of an entire group of people. And in these kind of manipulative ways, the Spanish would start to gain alliances, force people into alliances, or take the leadership out of different nations. And then this is how they would topple the Aztecs. They also used propaganda to portray the Aztecs as an especially brutal empire. So the Aztecs had this religious ceremony that included human sacrifices. The Spanish saw this and said, well, let's capitalize on this. So they propagated this idea that human sacrifices, and they propagated it even more than was actually practiced among the Aztecs. And even today, we remember the Aztecs as being especially brutal for having human sacrifices. But when we think of Rome, we don't think about the negative or violent nature of Rome. We think in kind of like this admiration of Rome, that it was this mighty, powerful empire. But how did it become mighty and powerful? We think about crucifixions, one of the bloodiest, horrific executions imaginable in antiquity. And this is Rome. We think about gladiators, these prisoners, these people forced to fight each other. We think of Christians being burned as candles for Emperor Nero. We think of all these things, but when we think of Rome, that's not what comes to mind. It's the glory, it's the might, it's the prestige, it's in admiration that most people remember Rome. Whereas the Aztecs, almost immediately people start to think about human sacrifice, and that is because of a very successful Spanish campaign to portray the Aztec people as barbaric, violent, and worthy of conquest, that they needed to be toppled and destroyed. When in reality, the Aztecs had a very complex, very large, very densely populated society. Another thing that really decimated the Native American culture was diseases that were brought over from Europe. So we talked about this interconnectedness of the quote-unquote old world. Europe was connected to Asia, was connected to Africa, and all of the diseases from these continents were spread through trade. Think the bubonic plague, which wiped out a huge population of Europeans. So they all went through the cycle and exposure of these diseases in the quote-unquote old world and developed a level of immunity to them. So the Europeans who came to the Americas were those who already developed immunity to stuff like the plague. Whereas the Native Americans were on a totally separate continent that did not have trade with China, Africa, and Europe beforehand. So this was the first time that they were exposed to a lot of diseases that Europeans carried with them into the Americas. And this would absolutely decimate the Native American populations. From this graph, you can tell from 1491 to 1620, 15 million Mexican people lived in the early 1500s, and by the beginning of the not even, it's a century later, 95.2 of that population was decimated by conquest and by disease. In Peru, upon European arrival, there were 10 million people, and that would be reduced to 600,000 people, 94% of the population, because of European arrival, because of mostly disease, would just decimate some of these regions. When the English would arrive on the eastern coast of North America, to the Puritans, the Pilgrims, the Virginians looking for gold, a lot of those Native American people had already been decimated by disease. And to bring us into our next lecture, this would be the flow of European arrival into the Americas. The English are going to settle on that eastern coast. The French move in more towards the Mississippi, more into the interior of the continent, and they don't come in large numbers. They come mostly to trade in furs. They send some traders, they send some soldiers, but they don't come in strong numbers, so they're not subjugating the Native Americans in the same way. They are mostly trading with Native Americans, and that's how they start to profit. The English, though, arrive in two different areas. We see the south here. This is the Virginia area, and this is the north. This is Massachusetts area. So we are going to be talking about these two areas of English settlement and their relationship with Native Americans in our following lecture. One thing to also think about is, how do we think of Native Americans today? They had these rich, complex societies, and they are a living and breathing culture today. Do we think of Native Americans as a living and breathing culture in the 21st century? Or have we kind of put them in a little box and viewed them as a just warlike or cartoonish or silly or primitive people? And have we created caricatures and mascots? Like, when you close your eyes and think of a Native American, is it a caricature? Is it a mascot? Or is it a living, breathing, rich culture that is still around today, in many cases fighting for their own rights to sacred religious land, to burial sites? Does our society grant them the same level of respect that we do for other peoples?